So South Africa is facing an escalating heroin addiction. Most heroin users in the country consume the drug by smoking it, as reported by treatment centers through, although a significant portion also choose to inject the drug. Now, researchers believe that the severity of the heroin crisis is being overlooked in South Africa, particularly because of misleading public narratives about the issue. Well, to chat to us about the most recent study done on SA's heroin crisis, we are joined by Shaun Shelly, who is a researcher and drug policy consultant. Shaun, good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. I think once we start talking about drug usage, it becomes quite an emotive discussion because so many families are dealing with the crisis of a family member addicted to one drug or another. But this recent study, the Journal of Illicit Economies and Development, having estimated an annual consumption of between 78,000 and 155,000 kilograms of heroin a year. I mean, that's a frightening number. Are we understanding just how big of a crisis we're facing in South Africa?
I think that to answer that question, it depends who you are and where you are. I think that if you're in Shoshongove and you're seeing a lot of people around you, you might think that the crisis is even bigger than what it actually is. Whereas if you're in a more affluent suburb, you won't even be aware of the crisis. So it's very much dependent on the exposure to it. But I would say that it is a pretty serious situation that we're in. Yeah,
because I'm looking at the numbers here. 155,000 kilometers is apparently, equals to the weight of 2 Airbus A320s. I mean, that's a lot of drugs. Yes. Where are the hot spots? I mean, you talk about Soshanguve, and a lot of the time when we talk about heroin, years ago it was thought to be a very affluent sort of drug, and that's not the case anymore.
Yes, and that is true. It was typically people who'd been for a gap year overseas, who came back from Europe, who maybe had a heroin dependency. Now we're seeing it very much for homeless people, people living on the street, people with lack of economic opportunity. It's very cheap, relatively speaking. It's 30 Rand for a small packet. And it's definitely, the demographics changed. What people don't realize is that the Niobe, Unga, all heroin. And that's where a lot of the misguided information has come from, thinking that heroin is something different to Niobe or Niobe is something different to any other drug.
Yeah, Niobe, that is, and that's what a lot of communities are complaining about. And so what is it exactly that drug dealers are doing that we seem to be overlooking, particularly from when we speak about the work done by law enforcement?
So, first of all, I think we must realize that the majority of people that we consider sort of drug sellers, drug dealers, are actually the very bottom of the food chain. There's a very long food chain because of the huge margins that are available in drugs. So your real problem, your transnational organized criminals, are not anywhere near where the drugs are consumed. They're in very affluent areas. They're controlling a lot of people. And largely the people at the bottom of the food chain are the ones that are going to get caught by the police. But for the police, it's kind of pointless exercise because they're replaced immediately, virtually. You get somebody else taking their place. And the borders, to control them, it's almost impossible. They can just dump sort of a ton of heroin into the currents and pick it up off the shore. It's very, very difficult to actually police that.
Yeah, 450,000 South Africans using heroin daily. Is that the most popular drug in terms of what we see going into our treatment centers at the moment?
At the moment, it's the one that's most serious, and so that one gets the sort of most highlighted in the treatment centers in the figures, because that's what people are really struggling with. And we see this sort of fluctuation between the stimulants like methamphetamine and crack cocaine and then heroin. At the moment, it is heroin. It's been climbing for a while, and in particular the injecting use of heroin, which is particularly dangerous, carries a lot of harms with it.
And what's the success rate then in treating addicts who are users of particularly heroin, Nyaope, Wonga, some of the drugs that you've talked about, the success rate coming out of our treatment centers?
Well, the fact is that the gold standard for treatment is to use what's called opioid agonist therapies, such as methadone and that. They're very seldom available to people. The city of Tshwane is the only municipality in the entire country to fund maintenance programs for heroin and to provide the necessary harm reduction services that are needed. We find that people who are just forced into short-term detox and abstinence, the recovery rate there is very low. The good news is that if people have economic opportunity and sort of some level of inclusion, that most people will resolve it by the age of sort of 30, 33, 34, round about there. But of course, in an economically depressed environment where people have little hope, and they've got the comfort of an analgesic or painkiller like heroin, that's particularly difficult to resolve.
Yeah, you've made the point that in a lot of the research that we are conducting around drug usage in South Africa, that we're not consulting the users themselves. Why is that important?
It's very important because, nobody knows drugs better than somebody using the drugs. And we would have sort of avoided all these pieces of misinformation and it's one of the most reliable sources of information.
Yeah, and you've said again that, where law enforcement is concerned, that we shouldn't be arresting or criminalizing the users.
It's really a pointless exercise. All you're doing is creating more users. You're providing a recruitment for the gangs. You're basically ensuring recidivism by that. There's no evidence that says that arresting people is going to reduce the level of drug use. Rather, we should take the money that's being spent on policing and securing all these prosecutions of low-level drug users into developing communities, and that will have a much better effect.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of this now as a parent, right, who's listening to this discussion, and you talk about, well, perhaps by age 33 and 34, in a really good case scenario, where a user has entered treatment, that by age 33 and 34 they would have resolved their addiction. But we need to talk about how they enter, right, how they start using, the ages that are most vulnerable, and some of the contributing factors, so that a parent or a young person who's watching this discussion starting their day can really have them have that at top of mind when they look at their young one.
Well, I think, any adolescent is at risk, especially when they're under peer pressure, especially when it's very difficult sometimes for parents to actually spend quality time with their kids because of the economic realities they have to face. So it's, we can't blame parents, we can't blame the schools, but I think we can blame the whole of society to really, we need to be looking after the youth, giving them alternative sources of enjoyment, of meaning in life, making sure that they participate in extracurricular activities, that we're not suspending them from schools, for example, because they get caught with cannabis, and then they're ending up on the streets with much older individuals and learning how to use drugs that way. People learn to use drugs. They don't just go one day and just decide to use it and it becomes an instant thing. It's a process. And we need to disrupt that process as much as possible, not through punishment, but through actually positive incentives and giving people hope in their future. Because if you've got no hope in the future, the value of drugs becomes exponentially more important.
The point that you make around keeping young people busy, I think that's a really important one. Have you really found that, in your research, as you look at particular areas, and I'm talking about locations, that where there is very recreational activities for young people, that's where you've got the biggest numbers?
So what I have seen is I've seen individual teachers and individual schools doing tremendous work to try and protect children as much as possible. And there we see less move toward dependent drug use and later initiation of drug use, which is very important. Later initiation has better outcomes. And obviously we want to try and prevent people using these kinds of drugs at all. But it's very difficult when there's no money for sports and that. And when we see lack of investment in education and lack of investment in resources for young people, that's where we see people increasing their drug use. And also when we've lost narrative history and the importance of our individual histories and our narrative histories, we also see people feeling more and more dislocated from the rest of society.
Yeah, it's a conversation that we simply cannot afford to stop having. So thank you so much for speaking to us, Shaun. Shaun Shelly is a researcher and drug policy consultant speaking to us on that there story.